All right, today marks exactly 30 years since Barend Strydom went on a killing spree in Pretoria. The then 23-year-old Strydom, dubbed Wit Wolf, killed 7 black people, injuring dozens others. A week earlier, he'd killed a black woman at the De Deer informal settlement in Johannesburg. He wanted to check whether he would be repulsed, he said, by the thought of killing someone, and he wasn't. Strydom claimed he was a Christian and had prayed for a number of days before committing the crime. He was sentenced to death but was released a mere 4 years later, along with other political prisoners, as part of liberation talks between the ANC and the National Party at the time. Strydom was granted amnesty by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1994. All right, now joining us in studio is Bradley Steyn, a survivor who was at the scene just in the moments just before that happened, now 30 years ago. He was at Strijdom Square on that day. He joins us in studio, and joining us via our Skype line is journalist Koketso Sachane, who we will speak to in just a moment. Gentlemen, thank you both for your time this afternoon. Bradley, I want to start with you. Just in reading up on this incident now, today, as we think about it being 30 years ago, it's chilling reading up on the details of what unfolded on those 5 blocks in Pretoria, Strijdom Square in particular. Take us through how you fit into the puzzle of the story.
So, yes, you're completely right. It is incredibly chilling. You know, recently we just went to archives and we discovered all the gruesome details, and we finally discovered what the names are of the victims and the survivors of the massacre. So yes, it was incredibly chilling. How I fit into this whole thing was I was on my way to go visit my mother at the State Theatre.
17 years old at the
time.
And
I was 17 years old. I just finished rugby practice at Littleton Manor High School, just outside Pretoria, which, you know, was a predominant military family community. So it was very white, very conservative. So for me to get out and walk the streets of Pretoria, you know, was great, because I could get out and see the sights and the sounds. I could hear the taxi guys, and I could hear the Kwela music. I could hear the call to prayer when I got down to Marabastad, and that's the route that I took that day. And I walked along Church Street and in an easterly direction, and I got to the corner of Strijdom Square, and I was just going to cross over the square to go and visit my mother at the State Theatre. I was going to use the stage door entrance. And I don't know if you can remember, Strijdom Square had a garden in the middle of it with a little wall around it and a small little Wandelpad kind of little pathway with little benches where citizens of this country would just sit and have lunch or hang out with their girlfriend or just get off their feet for a little bit. And as I was walking, I saw this guy with camouflage and a 9mm in his hand. And I thought to myself, is this a task force guy, is it a darky guy, or police officer? Is he trying to catch bad people? And then I saw him lift his 9mm up and point it at a black person who was just innocently sitting there, and he shot them. Obviously, the reality of the matter set in, and I realized that that wasn't a person threatening his life. And you don't shoot somebody without being attacked or your life being threatened. And so I dropped to the ground and I crawled along the outside perimeter wall of that garden. And then I stuck my head up and I looked through the garden, and I saw him walk up to another person and shoot that person too. I fell back down, and, you know, I was terrified. I was only a kid. And I didn't know what to do. And out of the corner of my ear, I heard, I just heard, psst, psst, Klein Baas, come. And I looked to the left, and there was a small little bench with a trash can and some more benches. And I saw this young black guy, and I call him Kind Eyes. And he called me, And I jumped over, I picked up my rugby bag and I dived over, and I was lying there, and I could hear people moaning and screaming and panic and pandemonium. And I looked around me when I was lying on the ground after I looked at Kind Eyes, who gave me this reassuring look that, don't worry, we're safer here now. And I looked around me, and there was an Indian lady there was some black people here, and some white people, and then all of a sudden somebody jumped up and ran towards Church Street, and he heard them, and he started shooting towards them. And then he noticed that there was scuffling, because people were panicking now, you know. Then I turned back, and we looked over, and we saw him walk up to this gentleman who was eating something, and he shot the guy, and the guy just sort of looked at him in disbelief, and then he shot him again. And that's when I heard the pain and the screaming, and at that point I think a switch flipped in Kind Eyes' head, because he jumped up and he ran to the northerly exit of that garden. And I scrambled, I grabbed my rugby kit bag. I needed to do something about it. I couldn't just sit there anymore, you know. I played rugby. I wanted to tackle him. I wanted to do something. And as I turned around that corner and I ran to follow Kind Eyes, I saw these bloodied footprints, and I stumbled upon Strijdom shooting Kind Eyes. And I ran up to Kind Eyes, and I put his head on my lap, and asked Strijdom why he was doing this, and he told me that hy doen dit vir die toekoms vir wit Suid-Afrikaners, and he had this smirk on his face, and now Kind Eyes, and he turned around and he ran off, but Kind Eyes was now terrified, and he was, later on I learned that a gunshot to somebody's lungs is very difficult for them, because they drown in their own blood, and he had been shot in the stomach as well, which is the most painful place to be shot. And I didn't know what to do, and I just stuck my fingers in his bullet wounds to try and, because the blood was pumping out of his lung. And I grabbed my rugby kit bag, and I grabbed my rugby jersey, and I put it on him. And now Kind Eyes was terrified, and so the police and the ambulance arrived, and the paramedics arrived. They tried to take me away. I freaked out. I told them to leave me alone. We got him onto my mom and dad arrived, and we got him onto a gurney, and he went to hospital. And my parents took me, and we went home. I never ever spoke to a police officer. My parents, not that I know of, you know, but I never went to court. I never did any statements, etc. The only reminder that I had of this was in a blue scrapbook my mom had, and that was a photo of me in the Bild, front page of the Bild newspaper, with Kind Eyes' head on my lap.
And did he survive?
We are busy. So he did. He went to hospital. My dad and I actually went and saw him the next day at hospital, and we sat there and we held his hand, and you know, he was still in so much pain, and he was really drugged up. And so that and the PTSD that I got from that event are the only memories that I have of the event.
I want to stop you there for just a moment, because we are all riveted as we relive this massacre through your eyes as a 17-year-old boy. But you talked about how nice it was on that day before this massacre happened, before these horrific events unfolded. Right. How wonderful it was to walk through the city. Koketso Sachane, I want to bring you into the discussion at this point, because your memories of what it was like to walk through the city centre of Pretoria, not only the day after this massacre, but even before that. Your memories of what it was like as a young black child in apartheid South Africa in the Pretoria city centre is altogether different.
It is, Michelle, and thank you very much for inviting me. I was 10 years old on this day in 1988, and I was born and raised in Atteridgeville, Pretoria, which is a township on the west of Pretoria. My life was going to school in the township, living in the township. That was my life. And my experience of town would be as a treat, where our parents would, on a particular Saturday, take us into town where we would sit and maybe have a pie, or my first experience of Wimpy. It was a treat. It was the outing. Town was an outing. And the Strijdom Square at the time, and the wall that my fellow guest speaks of, is where we would sit on a Saturday afternoon before we would have to take the taxi, leave town, and go back to the township. And my experience of white people really was through the lens of on the receiving end of tear gas, rubber bullets, a police officer that would be raiding your house looking for documents because of your father's political involvement, or walking down the street and suddenly there's tear gas and you have to run. And that was the totality of my experience or interaction with white people. So going into town, being amongst more white people than you've ever been around, your memory would be, you would live in constant fear walking the streets of Pretoria, because you don't know which of them is going to try and arrest you or throw tear gas or shoot rubber bullets. And that was life in general. And I think it was normal, but you realize later that there was a certain level of abnormality to it. And then what happened the day that Strydom killed those 7 people, when you go to school in the township, and your life is in the township, your parents go to town. Your parents go and work in town. And so you wait until 5 or 6 or 7 p.m. when your parents come home. And what happened with us was that we finished school and we're playing around in the streets, and suddenly some of the other parents that come in earlier, they are the ones that start talking about somebody died. A couple of people were killed. A white man killed black people. And the streets that we talk about, Strydom parked his car on the corner of, I think it was Spruce and Pretoria's. Both my parents worked on Pretoria streets at different areas. And so for me as a 10-year-old sitting at home after school, hearing that there were 7 black people that were killed and others that were shot by a white man, you wait and see if your parents are going to come home. You wait and see if your parents are possibly one of those people that have been killed. It was long before cell phones, long before being able to make a phone call, so you just hope for the best. And then, of course, there's the experience of going then to town following that massacre. And actually, I remember the evening news the same day, if not the day after, and the smirk that is so that we all know of Barend Strydom, where he seemed to have enjoyed every single moment. He loved it. I still remember his mustache and his little full hair. And for me, going to town, I was seeing Barend Strydom everywhere. Every single white man that I saw as a 10, 11-year-old was possibly somebody that could whip up a gun and kill me. That was my experience.
What a different country it was then. Those race obsessions during apartheid, hate and race hate was nurtured, it was encouraged in white children, especially, many would say, especially Afrikaans-speaking white children. I want to touch on what Koketso just mentioned there, that smile that Strydom had when he was finally handcuffed after killing and injuring so many people. The judge who sentenced him, Judge Louis Harms, he said Strydom was worse than any other terrorist, and this is a quote from the judgment. He says he was prepared to shoot people while smiling at them, while looking them in the eye, while the ordinary terrorist conventionally would set off a bomb and doesn't come into direct confrontation with the victim. We do have a clip that was taken of Barend Strydom during the trial. There he is now. And we do have a soundbite as well during an interview that was taken at that time, which we'd like to play for you now.
Tell me this, if I could give you a gun now, would you like to go over and shoot those blacks over there?
Definitely, yes.
And that is, of course, the two journalists discussing the case at the time. The one journalist had directly spoken to Barend Strydom, and that was his answer to the question, if I had to give you a gun now, would you go out and shoot black people again? And his answer was definitely yes. And you can see through most of the footage, he is smiling. He is quite happy with himself. Bradley, in terms of the research that you have done over the years, over these 3 decades, what has become of Barend Strydom?
Well, firstly, I disagree with the judgment that says, you know, he was sane, because no sane man can walk around killing people. I later on got into the security cluster, and I understand what terrorism is all about, counterterrorism. I've been in that space for a long time. And you don't go and kill innocent civilians that are unarmed. You go and you blow up a bomb in an office building at 10 o'clock at night. That's what you do. This man has no remorse whatsoever. I actually managed to track him down through some of my old intelligence contacts that I have. And I wanted to go and see him, but not expose who I was at the time, but just go and look him in the eye, smell his fear. Because now I'm not a 17-year-old boy. You know, I've been trained extensively now, and now I can do something about it. But so when I went to go and see him, it was under the guise of going to do business with him. He owns a framing business that he runs out of his small holding outside Pretoria. And it was very difficult for me because I had I was going through a roller coaster of different emotions with that man standing there. And still to this day, my other people have spoken to him as well extensively. And actually one of my school teachers that's been helping me with this. And he has no remorse. He has no remorse for it. And you know what I discovered in the documents later, after all this research that we've been doing over all these years, is that, you know, he said that his first bullet was supposed to be the start of the Third War, meaning die derde Boeroorlog. And that's very, very disturbing. And yeah, you know, the whole truth and reconciliation process, it hasn't done what it was supposed to do. You know, people didn't get compensated. You know, there's a lot of lives that are still completely ruined because of this man.
Yeah, 33 families in all affected and continue to be affected now, even 3 decades later. Gentlemen, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Koketso, I want to give you an opportunity just to give us just some closing thoughts very quickly before we close off the segment.
Michelle, I think there is a need for, as a country, to have a conversation as to how it's possible that a deal was made where Barend Strydom is able to happily live on a small holding in Hartbeespoort and sell frames to South Africans, considering the evil that he is and considering what he's done to our people. There are many other stories like that of deals that have been made to allow people to get scot-free for having never been held to account.
Yes, so many open wounds still remaining in South Africa's psyche.
So you know that today at 3 o'clock we are going to the Women's Living Heritage Museum, where we are doing a press conference because we are reading out the names of the victims and the survivors for the first time in 30 years. We'll be laying a wreath, and next year we are unveiling a plaque and the Tree of Healing at the Women's Living Heritage Museum, which is on Lillian Magoya Square. So we will be there at 3 o'clock today, and everybody is welcome to come out and pay tribute to the victims and the survivors. There was a survivor that got shot in the head and she survived.
So many incredible stories coming out of this, and I hope that just today, us talking about it, us starting a conversation about a story like Barend Strydom and those horrific murders that took place now 30 years ago today in Pretoria, that those important conversations do continue. Gentlemen, thank you both for taking the time to join us. Koketso Sachane is in Cape Town for us there. He is a journalist just recounting his memories as a 10-year-old boy, and joining us here in studio is Bradley Steyn. He was 17 years old at the time, walking across the square in Pretoria when Barend Strydom opened fire on innocent black civilians.